The first Jewish states, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Biblical legends. There are few ancient historical traditions that have seeped so much into popular culture as have those of the Israelites. One doesn't need to be Jewish or Christian to be well aware of the story of Moses and his parting of the Red Sea, or of the supposed reign of wise King Solomon. The story of David and Goliath has become a common way of referring to someone going up against a much more powerful foe or daunting challenge and emerging victorious. They might seem like biblical legends, but for the individuals who wrote them down in Judaea, in the Levant between the 6th and 1st centuries BCE, these were meant to be part of their history, a representation of their collective past. Admittedly, we can possibly disregard the accuracy of Moses splitting the Red Sea, but the stories put forward in the Torah, the Old Testament and other Jewish texts were still based on real kingdoms and real developments, or at least a cultural memory of them. Between the 11th and 6th centuries BCE, there were several kingdoms, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the Levant, which were inhabited and controlled by the Hebrews or Jewish people. Let's try and separate fact from fiction. Exodus and the emergence of Israel. Elements of the emergence of the Kingdom of Israel, as it is outlined in the Old Testament and the Torah, are well known. It began with the Israelites enslaved in Egypt under an oppressive Pharaoh. That same royal family had adopted an Israelite by the name of Moses, who, after a series of events that led to him rediscovering his heritage, led the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt, famously parting the Red Sea when it inconveniently got in the way of him and his people. They then spent 40 years wandering the desert before they arrived to the Levant and established their rule over some territory there. A kingdom was not actually established at this time. Instead, a group of religious judges ruled over the Israelites here for several generations, until such time as a ruler named Saul emerged as the first king of a united kingdom of Israel. He was then followed by Esbal, before King David ascended as the third king of Israel. We will turn to King David and his equally famous successor, King Solomon, in a moment. But let's just assess the historicity of this origin story. There is very little concrete evidence of any kind that the Israelites were a people who escaped from Egypt, spent 40 years wandering in the desert, and then founded a society ruled by judges for several generations. Indeed, most of this is very fanciful. The story of Moses dividing the Red Sea, for instance, involves supernatural elements, while the idea that the Israelites would have spent 40 years wandering around the Near East before arriving to a land which is very near Egypt and the Red Sea, the region they started from, makes no sense. All of this being said, it is entirely plausible that a kingdom emerged in the Levant around the 11th century, one that was ruled over by an individual who was the source for the tales of King Saul that have come down to us. The people here were also clearly beginning to adhere to a religion from which Judaism stems. For instance, there is archaeological evidence of the people here refraining from eating pigs from the early Iron Age, an animal which is not considered kosher by Jewish people. There were also several new powers, like the Phoenicians, who emerged here in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE as the withdrawal of Egyptian and Hittite power from the Levant during the Late Bronze Age collapse created a power vacuum into which a new regional power like the Israelites could have emerged. Hence, the tradition handed down by Exodus and books like it from the Old Testament, such as the Book of Judges, might not be 100% historically accurate, but it does represent a sort of cultural memory of how the Kingdom of Israel emerged around the 11th century BCE. This also chimes with the statements made in texts like the Book of Judges. In this, the Israelites are described as being at war with neighboring powers like the Moabites, Edomites, and Midianites during the era in which the judges ruled over Israel. Archaeological evidence accumulated in the last century would certainly seem to suggest that there were substantial powers ruling over Jordan and northwestern Arabia in the early Iron Age, who are synonymous with the Moabites, Edomites, and Midianites, once again lending credibility to the idea that while the Jewish-Christian tradition around the Kingdom of Israel is quite fanciful, it was still based on actual events here just over 3,000 years ago. The Kingdom of David and Solomon. According to both Jewish and Christian law, for nearly a century, the lands controlled by the Israelites were ruled over by two great kings, David and Solomon. Saul, the first king of Israel, was succeeded by his son Esbal or Ishbosheth. This succession was disputed by the tribe of Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, who instead favored the candidacy of their leader, David. A conflict followed. David emerged from this victorious and established the Davidic line or House of David. He ruled for about 40 years and was then followed by his son Solomon, who also ruled for about 40 years. There is debate as to when this occurred. Christian tradition tends to argue that these two ruled over Israel in the 10th century BCE, while some Jewish texts place their reigns to the 9th century BCE. There are also fabulous elements to their reigns. David, for instance, is famous for having slain Goliath, an immense Philistine giant who is killed by David wielding a slingshot. Later, he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Solomon was primarily revered on account of his alleged wisdom and moral judgment. There is very little evidence to suggest that either David or Solomon existed, at least not in the form which the Christian and Jewish sources suggest. That being said, many historians today do allow for the fact that there probably were rulers of Israel around the 10th and 9th centuries BCE who the characters of David and Solomon were based on, and who did rule over a kingdom that was at its height here in the early Iron Age. The issue is that their feats were exaggerated in later centuries as Jewish scholars, living through the tumultuous period of Jewish decline that followed from the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE, looked back on this earlier era as a golden age and exaggerated the alleged accomplishments of its rulers. As ever, the term cultural memory needs to be kept in mind here. David and Solomon and the unified kingdom of Israel almost certainly did not exist in the manner which later Jewish scholars portrayed them, but they were nevertheless based on a cultural memory, a kernel of truth about what had happened during the days of the Kingdom of Israel. The Temple of Solomon. One thing which is strongly attributed to Solomon, and which was probably a historical fact, was that the first Temple of Jerusalem was built during his reign. No archaeological evidence of this temple has ever actually been found. That being said, scholars agree that it did exist. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem was simply built over so effectively in subsequent times that the original edifice has been lost to history. While it clearly would have existed, the idea that wise King Solomon built it is much more disputable. As with anything to do with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, we need to bear in mind that the texts which attribute the construction of it to Solomon were written hundreds of years after his supposed reign. In this instance, the foremost source is the Book of Kings, most likely written in the 6th century BCE and completed in the 5th. What is certain is that this temple became the epicenter of Jewish religious worship. The Jewish religious world revolved around it. It was an imposing precinct, one which dominated the center of Jerusalem and which was divided into different sectors. The building was a Langbau temple, meaning it was a largely rectangular edifice, one that was much longer than it was wide. There were 3 areas to it: a large porch area where all worshippers were allowed to congregate, which was known as the Ulam, followed by the Hekal or sanctuary, and then the Holy of Holies, known as the Debir. The high priests and other senior figures were the only ones allowed into the Debir, or inner sanctum. Because of its significance, Jewish people congregated in Jerusalem on particular holy festivals, and the city became the holiest site in Judaism. Division. While the reigns of David and Solomon were presented by Jewish scholars of later centuries as a golden age of the Israelite kingdom, they also laid the seeds of division. Solomon's building program had been costly, and the burden of it seems to have fallen unfairly on the northern tribes who lived far from Jerusalem. As a result, when he was succeeded by his son Rehoboam, a civil war broke out not long afterwards. As recounted in the books of Kings and Chronicles in the Old Testament and various Jewish texts, this led around 931 BCE to the division of the unified kingdom of Israel into two separate states. The kingdom of Judah emerged in the south as a much reduced continuation of the united kingdom of Israel, one which Rehoboam continued to rule over from Jerusalem, while the kingdom of Israel, also known as the kingdom of Samaria, developed in the north as a breakaway Jewish state. It was ruled over by Jeroboam. The similarity in names is not indicative of some familial strife, and Jeroboam was not a brother of Rehoboam. As ever, questions of historical accuracy hang over these biblical accounts. Was there ever really a Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and did they usher in the creation of a kingdom of Judah and a northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria? The answer is we don't know for sure, but at least some of this is based on historical developments. Israeli archaeologists working back in the 1980s and 1990s concluded that there does seem to have been Israeli kingdoms here in the 8th and probably the 9th centuries BCE. However, there is nothing to determine if there really was a Rehoboam, Jeroboam, or an Israeli civil war. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah. These kingdoms of Israel and Judah fared differently after going their own way. The kingdom of Israel in the north lasted about 2 centuries. In the 8th century BCE, it fell prey to a resurgent Mesopotamian power, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Jewish law and corresponding data concerning the Neo-Assyrian Empire indicates that around 720 BCE, King Sargon II of Assyria invaded and conquered Samaria and Galilee before enslaving tens of thousands of Jewish people there and sending them to Mesopotamia. It was this which subsequently gave rise to the idea of 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel being lost, and how only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin and the priestly tribe of Levi survived. These latter tribes survived in the kingdom of Judah to the south. This more southerly kingdom fared better for longer. Unlike with events back in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, when the historicity of the kingdom of Israel is open to serious debate, there is no real denying that the kingdom of Judah existed and ruled over a substantial part of Israel in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Archaeological evidence attests to this, as do written sources from other cultures. For instance, the Nimrud tablet, produced by the Assyrians of Mesopotamia around 730 BCE, refers to Judah and provides independent verification of the kingdom of Judah. This was in the midst of growing Assyrian intervention in the Levant. The Tel Dan Stele, a stone slab relating elements of Israelite history, dates to a century before the Nimrud tablet and provides further evidence written in Aramaic of the kingdom of Judah in the 9th century BCE. The information written on it corroborates elements of what was produced in the biblical and Hebrew religious texts many centuries later. Thus, there is growing archaeological data to substantiate the idea that the cultural memories that the Jewish sources are indicative of were substantially based on the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which existed for many centuries between the 12th and 6th centuries BCE. The destruction of the temple. The history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah came to an end because of outside interference and a calamitous episode in the early history of the Jewish people. The kingdom of Israel first managed to emerge in the 11th century BCE as a result of the late Bronze Age collapse and the power vacuums it created in places like the Levant. Powers like the Israelites and the Phoenicians were suddenly able to develop their own kingdoms after centuries of the Levant being dominated by more powerful and aggressive neighbors like the Egyptians and Hittites. The respite didn't last forever, though. As the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age and conditions became more settled, new powers began to emerge once again from the more traditional centers of power in the Near East, specifically in Mesopotamia to the east in what is now Iraq. As we have seen, a Neo-Assyrian empire had formed here at the very end of the 10th century BCE. At its height in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, it conquered much of the Near East, and its rulers like Ashurbanipal the Great campaigned extensively into the Levant and Egypt, destroying the kingdom of Samaria in the process. This meant that at times the kingdom of Judah was also effectively a vassal state of Assyria. That being said, it retained considerable independence, and as long as the Jewish people paid their tribute, they were largely left to their own devices. Where that changed was when a new power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, swiftly conquered and replaced the Neo-Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia at the end of the 7th century BCE. Their foremost ruler, King Nebuchadnezzar II, was determined to conquer the Levant more concretely. Around 598 BCE, he campaigned westwards and raided Jerusalem. He then returned a decade later and laid siege to the city again. A lengthy period of resistance followed, but eventually, after 30 months or so, the Jewish and biblical narratives held, the city walls were breached and the Babylonians streamed into Jerusalem. Everything that could be plundered from what was one of the great cities of the Near East at that time was taken. More critically, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the destruction of Solomon's temple. It was completely torn down, something which matches with the lack of archaeological remains of it on the Temple Mount. With this, the first temple period of Jewish history came to an end, and the kingdom of Judah with it. For hundreds of years thereafter, the Jewish people and their lands in the Levant would be ruled by the Babylonians and other external powers. The Babylonian Captivity and its aftermath. The destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem was the end of a golden age of Jewish life in the Levant. Centuries of strife followed. Many people in the kingdom of Judah were captured and taken away into slavery by the Babylonians, a development known as the Babylonian Captivity. This also marked the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, which saw Jewish communities dispersed all around Eurasia and North Africa over the next millennium. The Babylonian captivity only lasted a half a century until the Persians conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and their ruler Cyrus the Great sent them back to the Levant to rebuild their temple at Jerusalem. On the surface of it, this seemed to presage a new period of liberty for the Jewish people. But while the reconstruction of the temple ushered in the Second Temple period, Cyrus now ruled over the Levant, and Persian power extended into what had been the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This situation continued for 2 centuries and only ended when the Jewish people here swapped Persian rule for Macedonian rule during the conquests of Alexander the Great. Finally, in the 2nd century BCE, the Maccabeans managed to successfully revolt against the Seleucid Empire, one of the successor states to Alexander's empire. The kingdom of Judaea, which resulted from this, remained autonomous for over a century. But soon the Romans arrived and turned Judaea into a client kingdom and then a province. The impact of this, as is relatively well known, was dreadful. The Jews revolted over the belittling of their religious rights by the Romans in 66 CE, and 4 years later, the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed yet again, bringing the Second Temple period to an end. The Jewish diaspora that followed over the next 2 centuries drove a huge proportion of the Jewish people to North Africa, Turkey, Italy, and other parts of the Roman Empire. The history of the Hebrews. Part of the reason why the authentic history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah can be so hard to establish is that the history of the Hebrews or the Jewish people was not written down until very late in all of this. The events, for instance, of the Exodus or the reigns of King David and King Solomon were not recorded by contemporaries or people who lived within a generation or two of the events they purported to describe. The book of Exodus, the earliest of all these biblical and Jewish texts, was not written down until around the 6th century BCE. The events of the reign of King David are primarily recounted in Samuel 1 and Samuel 2 in the Old Testament. It is broadly understood that these books were only first committed to paper in the 6th century BCE at the earliest, half a millennium after the events they purport to relate. This is not uncommon for the ancient world. It was quite regular for stories and quasi-historical accounts of a people's origin story to be passed down orally from generation to generation and to have only recorded in writing after hundreds of years once those societies became more literate. Such is the case with the stories ascribed to Homer about the Trojan War, 2 of which, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have survived down to modern times. What is interesting in the case of the Hebrews is that they began writing down and preserving these stories right around the time of the destruction of the First Temple and the Babylonian captivity. This was a society which feared for the survival of its history and culture and was now seeking to preserve it in writing. They did a relatively good job. While the foregoing has demonstrated that we need to take the stories of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which are found in the Old Testament, the Torah and other texts with a very large pinch of salt, they do attest to the fact that some 3,000 years ago 2 considerable Jewish states existed in the Levant, emerging out of the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to show your support and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.